Or you could do awesome. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. We have just barely a quorum here of the steering committee, and here comes Jared too. Excellent. As usual, all the materials are online. I'll drop the link in the chat. Um, Welcome, Jared.
Good
We're just
morning.
getting going. Um, okay, so our agenda, I'm happy to share my screen with that. It looks like this. Um, Joey has agreed to join the steering committee as to fill that vacant seat. And so you all as a committee need to formally appoint her. Um, we have an agenda for May 5th that we want to walk through. And then we want to spend just a little time talking about the progress and the vision for the chapter writing, picking up where we left off last time we talked about that. That's what we planned to do. We wanted to take public comment if there was any in the middle at 9:10. Before we dive into that, any questions on the agenda today? Okay. It's been fun to see several of you at these public events, so thanks everyone for coming out to those. It's been, I find them very rewarding. And we still have some more this week, one tonight and one Wednesday. So if you go tonight, you'll see Indra will be running it, and Wednesday I'll be back doing it. So hope to see folks there if you're able to come out. All right. Minutes are attached. Does anybody need a moment just to click through and double check that they are accurate? Would anybody like a little bit more time? Okay. Any concerns with the minutes? Okay. Let's treat them as approved. Thanks so much. Um, so we just need to formally approve Joey. Before we do that, any concerns with that or any reflections before we do that? Okay. Um,
All right.
let's, anybody
Yeah.
not in favor of doing this?
No, I think it's great.
Okay,
Finally,
great.
to have another house person is super.
And
Awesome.
thank you to Joey for stepping up.
Absolutely. Okay. Sarah Clark, Julie Moore, all good with that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. All right, so Joey's in. That is good, and it's a key time here for you all. All right, let's take a look at the agenda for the next council meeting. And I'd love to get some feedback on this. Try to make this a little bit bigger. Hang on a second. Is this small? Is that better? Okay. Oops. So there's a couple things that we're aiming to have in the next meeting. The core of which, like the one we're spending the most time on, is reviewing public input. And Charlotte's here on the call. Like Charlotte and I and Sophie and others are creating a format for the public input sessions that also can weave in other things that come in. And so what the council will receive, I guess, this Friday, is because the last virtual event is on Thursday. What the council will receive this Friday is a package that has individual events where you have a high-level summary at the top that's maybe a page, and then a detailed annex that groups things by like topic, like priority action, if they are directed towards specific action. So the idea is you get some high-level stuff at the top and then the detail down below in a way that is easy to reference if you're like, oh, I want to see what everybody said on Cap and Invest, or I want to see what everybody said on, such and such priority action. So we're going to push very hard to have a nice summary available by Friday that pulls everything together. So this is a key piece of what we're doing. And because we're going to be sending this, pretty meaty thing on Friday, we need to leave some reading time. And I'll be interested to hear from all of you if you think 15 minutes is enough. because I think it's just important that counselors get a chance to read something if it came in Friday. All right, and then we'll do an exercise similar to what we've done before when we're looking at comment. Remember when we reviewed the meetings from the fall, when we did the input sessions, we'll probably do some similar exercises to try to get people to like name what they're seeing and hearing in this feedback. Okay, so that's the first chunk of the meeting, and you'll see we're spending an hour on that. We can talk about how we want to shift around time if we need to. After a break, some public comment. Jane says the consultant will be ready to present the business as usual analysis on Monday. And so we've dedicated almost an hour to do that. Jane, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to acknowledge about the public comment, David, just two things. One, I just wanted to say, in addition to the 3 public meetings that we're hosting this week that are on the calendar, A&R is doing a lunch and learn today also that we're going to weave in around some comment too, but we'll make sure we show that as distinctly as state comment on the recommendations. Sophie and I are doing that. And then also wanted to acknowledge that there's one meeting that we weren't able to get on the books before Monday. Thought you might speak to the youth meeting that will happen Tuesday, acknowledging that we still thought it was important to proceed with the support of the youth subcommittee members and youth counselor rep and VEP, but that will have to come separately.
Yeah, thanks, Jane, for that. Yeah, so we are doing a meeting with youth reps and with Veep, who's been our partner in youth engagement. And unfortunately, the time to do that was next Tuesday. But what we'll do is we'll make a separate summary from that and send that over to everybody. And I think we're going to feel pressed for time on Monday anyway to look through all this material. So hopefully the youth folks can read on their own. And so when we come back together 2 weeks from Monday, we'll include that in. I'll note that there's also other activity happening, like the CBI team and the Climate Action Office folks have set up a meeting with a community partner to talk with the former refugee community and others in Winooski area. And that's going to be happening this week. And so that kind of summary we'll pull in as well.
That was actually canceled, just so you know, David.
Oh, no.
Yeah, unfortunately, our cultural advisor who was helping us with that, his brother passed away.
Oh, gosh. So sorry. Okay. All right. Well, that hopefully will happen in the future and in a way that still can feed into the timing of this. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just had a clarifying question for the 130 portion that's labeled identifying issues requiring attention to finalize priority actions. Is that meant to be identifying issues kind of following up from the baseline analysis or identifying outstanding questions or areas for further detail or potential revision based on the public engagement sessions? I guess my thinking is if it's the latter, it feels like it should be paired with the review of public input rather than kind of come after the BAU. I'm worried that people won't be as focused on the BAU if they're kind of thinking about taking in the public input and then figuring out, trying to look across our draft priority recommendations and seeing how that might affect those. So I'm wondering if it is the latter, if we could pair them, and maybe that would mean flipping the order of the BAU and the public input, so that the public input goes right into that discussion that you've got for 130. But if I'm reading that wrong, please let me know.
The way I was thinking about it, we were thinking about it, Jared, was that we would start that process in the way we do the exercise for the public input of like pivoting our thinking about what we're hearing and then what that means for revision or things that need work in the priority actions. So we would start that process, and then we'd have public comment, and then we'd have BAU, the business as usual. And then we'd round it up to say, all right, given the public comment, given the business as usual, given what we heard in this meeting from anyone who spoke, like what really is our punch list of issues. So
So
I was
it's meant to be
it's like
responsive,
it's like a wrap up for everything.
responsive to both.
Yeah,
So,
that was kind of the thought is
okay,
like once we hear all of this, what do we need to do over the next like 2, 3 weeks to finish up?
that
Does
makes
that make
sense.
sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm good with it.
Okay,
Thank
cool. All right. And right. And so that would be the last thing we do. We left a significant amount of time for the business as usual analysis, almost an hour. Um, so that folks can, yeah. So Jared, that seems right. I want to just double check. That's great. It leaves us this sort of 20-minute block at the end to really make a punch list of things and figure out how that stuff is going to happen. Because I have an assumption here that folks are going to name things coming out of the public comment. Be like, okay, well, maybe we need to do a little bit more like this, or maybe we need to do a little like this, right? And then the work is actually going to get done over the following 2 weeks. And the council may need to say, oh, Jared and Julie, can you go off and do this thing, right? Or Rich and so, right? Or Jael and whatever, right? I have a feeling that there's going to be some assignments of somebody go fix this, and I can be helpful, or to the facilitation team can be helpful if needed. But I'm guessing that that's what happens in this space is not only issue identification, but how do we fix it? Like, how do we get this done so that we can show up 2 weeks from this meeting and feel like we have priority actions that are hitting the mark. Okay, so that's sort of the vision here. Jane or anybody else who's been involved in these conversations about getting this agenda, am I missing anything?
No, I just wanted to acknowledge that we have a run through with SEI on Wednesday about the BAU, so and the presentation. So hopeful that we'll be able to get that out with a few days of some lead time for people to look at. And I think we've acknowledged this in the past that we've been thinking about two BAUs, like a best case as things stand, as we think we know now, and then a worst case if a lot of rollbacks happen through the federal government and other ways. We've now been talking with SEI more about a very interactive BAU, which for folks who are aware of the LEAP model, just being able to be clear about what we're turning on and off. And so I think we're thinking of one BAU where we have really the ability to make it very dynamic as things may or may not change in the near term or longer term. See that for folks.
Thanks, Jane. Jared?
One of the things that I'm thinking about for that 130 section and then what comes after that is trying to anticipate the different types of next steps that might come up and then our process for handling those depending on what they look like. It feels to me like the most straightforward will be areas where there's an outstanding question, additional clarification, or detail is requested. And that feels like exactly the type of scenario you identified, David, where it's like we identify that, we give that guidance to, the relevant co-chairs or authors or co-authors, so that we have those questions answered and that clarity delivered. I think that there's also a category that we could get into where there are recommendations where we're either trying to get to consensus or consensus. There's probably three categories, right? There's like
Yeah.
consensus already exists. We're really close to consensus. And then there are recommendations where there's just disagreement and are likely going to end up having to go to end up being a vote of the council.
Yeah.
I just wonder if it's helpful in terms of the context setting or the next steps of distinguishing between those types of feedback and distinguishing and reminding ourselves of the processes that we've used and agreed to so that we can kind of bucket those out a little bit to help us with our process.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jared. One of the trickiest things about that is that it's hard to know, whether consensus is impossible, right? It's like, oh yeah, no, we're just no way, right? That's a tough call to make at this stage, right? And so it feels like, the council, if it's willing to work in good faith towards finding something that feels like consensus, like that's still the move until we have to actually vote on something,
Yep.
right? But I hear you loud and clear, Jared. There absolutely could be content in here that, is just going to require a vote. Right. Okay.
Yeah, and that sounds exactly right to me. I'm just aware that we have some new counselors, some folks who weren't familiar with the process. I think we strive for consensus in good faith, but recognize that that wasn't always possible last time, and I don't think it'll always be possible this time. And so, just reminding folks of those different categories and different processes, I think would be helpful.
Thanks, Jared. Liz?
I think Jared raises a good point, and I'm glad you hear that you have a way to kind of preview that and think about it. I was wondering whether there are some issues that are coming up in these public meetings that just don't fit neatly into whether we're quote finalizing or changing in some way, or clarifying in some way priority actions, but instead what our priority actions are. And it may just be my own experience from the public meeting that I attended in person in particular. But are we getting a lot of comments at these meetings about some version of either too many priorities, too many overlapping priorities, or not focused enough, in which case it feels like there's a different conversation a little bit?
I'm glad you said that, Liz, because indeed it is a fairly consistent theme.
Okay. We should think about how to deal with that, because I'm worried that
Yeah.
we're on a train similar to what we were on the first time around, where just because we've written something down, it's now in unless it's voted out, as opposed to kind of holistically thought about. And it's getting back to the drafting issue of pieces rather than a whole plan, and especially on the overlapping parts. Yeah, I'm just concerned we don't have a good process for how to fix that.
Yeah, I think that's right. If we go back, what's interesting is the public input in the sessions that I've led very much mirrors what we've been talking about all along, but we haven't fully acted on, which is that model of the hazard mitigation plan, I think it is, or I can't remember what's the name of the plan we were trying to model, which is they've got a big list, they've got a somewhat shorter list, and then they had like a top 10 list, right? And the step that we haven't made yet is saying, what's our top 10 or top whatever, right? And that was a frequent piece of feedback that I was hearing at the meetings. And so if folks are eager for that, and I've heard Jared and others and say, hey, can we do this? We're going to need to make some time to do an exercise that is defensible about why we would select certain things in that top 10. And we can make some time at our second meeting in May to do that. And you all as a steering committee can be very helpful in making sure we're getting the criteria right and everything like that for the process of getting to that top 10. Jane?
Yeah, Liz's comments, other comments were all really helpful. And I had only raised my hand to help support sort of your discussion about this agenda, because I wanted to acknowledge the flow of the council meetings a little bit and acknowledge that May 19th, the meeting 2 weeks after this one, is really all about like the priority recommendations again. And there's space in that meeting, I think, to really like use this end wrap up of Monday's meeting to project 2 weeks from now, that where you can really go back to what you want to focus on, acknowledging it's still only 3 hours and it's hard to get a lot done. But I do think that end wrap up should really look forward to that May 19th meeting with the council to get everybody set up for success then. And then also wanted to acknowledge that we turned one of the meetings in June, and Liz might remember which one, into a longer all-day meeting in person, where yeah, thank you, where we really wanted to, you know, sit together and really get through everything, the content, to sort of set us up to put together the final plan in the few weeks after that. So I think you should really look at the schedule, make sure the schedule is hitting the mark to do everything you're now thinking you want to do, and make any adjustments that you want to now, so that we're not like scrambling the last week, but trying to really get to a place where we can adopt a plan. And the way we have it set up is trying to adopt it on June 23rd, which would still give us another week if we had to, but I know people are sort of headed off in different directions. So just wanted to put that forward. And then also just in comment around new counselors, I don't think we have this on the schedule today, but just wanted to acknowledge we just got an appointment for a new counselor last week for the seat that represents CAP agencies. And it's a gentleman from Capstone, and Liz, I'm forgetting his name, or Julie saw that too. So, but we'll be working to try to get that person up to speed. But it's a hard time to really step into this process. I'll just acknowledge for them.
Thanks, Jane. Julie?
Yeah, so it's Will Eberly is the person who's been appointed on behalf of Capstone. And I agree, Jane, I think it is a really challenging time to jump on the train when it's barreling down the tracks. I wanted to emphasize what Liz Miller was saying, that at the meeting I was at, there was a lot of concern that 50 is just too many. And I think it also goes beyond that to the technical way that a number of the priorities are written. And I guess I think a conversation about who our target audience is or a reminder about who our target audience is really important here too. If this is a plan that's meant to be publicly accessible, I took seriously the feedback from that meeting that these are not written in an accessible manner. And just another piece that I think we're going to need to wrestle with over the next few weeks.
Right. And we could rethink the way we're using language in our priority recommendations in particular. Right. And it's an interesting balance, right? Because you want it to be accessible. And also, I know the council has some precision in some of the things they're saying. So how do you thread that needle of like accessibility? Like you can understand what's being said and why, and then there's the level of precision needed. Okay. Ooh. Jared?
Yeah, on that last point, I think that the part of the challenge is that there's, as I see it at least, there's multiple audiences, and those audiences are looking for different things. And it feels to me for the general public, it is important that the highlights, the executive summary, the key takeaways from the plan are accessible and understandable. But I think there's another audience that is legislators, administrative agencies, program implementers, for which detail is important. And that's where I think having a more specific and in-depth element to the full plan as a whole is important. So to me, it helps to remember that, we can produce, we can work to not sacrifice important information and detail in the full cap, but we can also produce executive summaries, summary 2-pagers or shorter documents that are meant to be shorter and more accessible. So I just want to make sure that in an effort to meet one audience, we don't leave something out for another key audience.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah. Okay. This has been really helpful. What I'm taking away from this is when that wrap-up conversation looks like it's increasingly important, right? Important to do a couple things with it. Signal the kinds of work that needs to happen. And some work is like Jared says, some is like a bunch of folks get together and solve a pretty, specific problem. There might be another bucket of things where it's looking super unlikely we might reach agreement on it, but we still need to test those waters, and have an idea of like, can we as close as we can get? The other piece I'm taking away is about how do we respond to the feedback that 54 still isn't a tight enough focus, um, from a messaging standpoint and a prioritization standpoint. So can we put a process in place either on May 19th or June 2nd that gets us to a tighter set of ideas? And in that process, both for the 54 and for the tighter set, can we use language in different ways so that it's more accessible? Right? Maybe there's versions of it. It's like there's the plain language version, then there's the detail that we need to make sure it gets in there somewhere. Right? Okay. Jane?
I just wanted to remind people, because we haven't really overemphasized this, but we do have, or hope to have, we're still working through some stuff, but contractual support through a retainer contract that will help do that plain language editing for us. So just wanted to put that out there.
And Jane, can I confirm with you that essentially the way the velocity we're working at, they're going to take it once we're done in June, right? And from July on, they'll take it and then do a nice edit throughout.
I think the hope is actually that they're going to do the edit in June, but I should confirm and we can talk about that. But the
Yeah.
idea was that the language for the plan would be edited in June. There was some other thought about graphics and a summary document, like the shorter one we actually had for the first cap also, that would come after.
Okay. That would be really helpful to drill into that and like when they would need something so they could do something for us, like how fast a turnaround they could do. Okay. I just switched my screen back to our agenda here. We're a little ahead of schedule. However, are there other things folks want to say about that agenda we just looked at for May 5th? Is there anything else that caught people's attention there? Okay. All right. Oh, I had a question for you all. The 15 minutes of reading time here, does that seem like the right balance of a reading time? Would you want more, less? Any thoughts on that? I know, Julie, you've said a couple times you've had some meetings where it's like organized reading time that you've really appreciated.
No, I think that's about right, recognizing we only have an hour to both read and then discuss. I think that strikes the right balance.
Thanks. Okay. Does that work for others too?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Great. Um, sorry, I've got the wrong things open. All right, so if you're joining our meeting and you wanted to weigh in on some of this, this is a good time to do it. Let's do our public comment that we had at 9:10. Let's do it a little early here. So if you're joining us today and you aren't a steering committee member, hi, Annette, welcome.
Good morning. I wondered if there is an update on the two other empty seats. There's the manufacturers and the rural communities. They've been empty for a while.
Yeah.
I think I asked a couple meetings ago, but I didn't get any response.
Jane?
We've made that clear to the legislature, but it's the legislature's job and we haven't heard anything. So in all honesty, we were surprised to get the cap one finally. But that came from the Senate. So those other two seats are House appointed seats and we haven't heard anything from the House.
I've been asked by some people if they think there's any point in applying, and I took a look at who is on the council, and I've never looked at it through this lens before, but if you do it in this way, almost everyone has some sort of political connection. It's, it's like you have to be a member of the legislative club, David Dean, Liz Miller, Dave Mears, people who have served in state government have been filling the House and Senate seats. And frankly, my response to some of the people who've asked me is don't waste your time because they're not going to appoint someone who doesn't have some sort of political connection. So I keep pointing out that there is a lack of geographic diversity. I think the youth seat came from Bennington, and I think that's great. But I don't know who talks to anybody in the House or Senate leadership, but the state's interests are not well reflected by the makeup of this council. And I've applied for the cross-sector mitigation seat a couple of times, and the I'm not a member of the club that appears to be welcome. My other question is, I'm wondering in these sessions that you're having in person with the public, are you getting the specific comments on the specific recommendations, or is it still this more general thing that I heard at the first virtual meeting?
I'm happy to answer that final question, Annette, which is we are getting specific comments. In fact, we're encouraging members, participants to write little Post-its on individual flashcards, and that's happened a lot. And so there is some of that more specific feedback. I think people are coming in from wherever altitude they're coming in from. And we're encouraging folks as much as possible to laser in on specific feedback that the council could act on.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that because following the council is clear that's what you really need at this stage is the flashcards that you have. You need to hear specifically about those items, and more general comments aren't helpful. So, okay, I think that's all I have today. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. Jamie,
I just wanted to acknowledge also that I didn't mean to throw the House under the bus and acknowledge that they did have a glitch in their system back in December where the speaker's assistant acknowledged that they lost all applicants for council seats because we knew of people who had applied specifically for the manufacturing seat and hadn't heard anything. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that they acknowledged having a problem, but I haven't heard anything since that. So especially with Joey now on board and Liz, maybe there's an opportunity to reach back out to Connor, the assistant. But again, this is a very hard time to bring people on. So there's also a balance of acknowledging we are in the position we're in and trying to get people on is hard. So.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. All right. So next up, we wanted to do a quick check-in on the chapter writing. And this is something we spoke about with the full council. We spoke about with you all as a steering committee, and we're just trying to make sure we've got processes in place that will get us over the finish line in a good way. Jane, you had put together a couple of slides on this. Do you want to walk us through this? Do you want me to? I'll just put it up on the screen right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, it reiterates what you all decided and puts a question forward to you all that I kind of felt was still lingering about the role of the steering committee. The Secretary Moore, Julie acknowledged that there might be a place for some consolidated edits by the steering committee to support some consensus recommendations, consensus edits that would go to the council. So just wanted to put this forward to all of you and see if there was a role explicitly for the steering committee and then talk through a little bit of what will happen in the timeline. So Liz has been working to support an email that went out to the original lead authors, the counselors of both the Jared, I'm sensitive to, I don't want to recall them like contextual, but contextual chapters and recommendation chapters. and giving them the guidance that the council approved at the last meeting, really striving to tighten them up, shorten the chapters. And then CAO has been offering to support the development of smaller groups to really coordinate and deal with the redundancy. And in those groups, including the co-chairs for the recommendation chapters. And then Liz has been working independently with the leaders of those contextual chapters, Leslie Ann, Ken Jones, others, to really tighten those up separately. So sort of striking a balance of like hand holding with like some concerted support to both help with administration of pulling groups together and then discussions. David and Liz and I came up with the idea that we would hold 2 office hours, is what I chose to call them on the slide, around for the recommendation chapters to actually pull folks together to ensure that the guidance is really sort of like clear and they know what is being asked to update the chapters with. And to do that with ag and eco and rural resilience together, knowing that there's even though we're pulling the ag and eco 3 chapters together, there's still going to be redundancy between the ag and eco and rural resilience chapters. So pull those people all together in one session, and then have another one focused on the cross-sector mitigation chapters. David and Liz would support those, have a facilitated hour-long conversation that really gets people in a good place so that we can sort of send them off to finish writing those chapters in a way that we think will come back in an acceptable way to pull it all together. And then if you go to the next slide.
Yeah, and just to note, those are already scheduled for next week on
Oh,
Tuesday.
perfect.
Yeah.
And then the steering committee, this is a question to all that I wanted to put to all of you, is that we have the chapters are due back on May 19th to the climate office. The idea could be that we would share them to the steering committee and you would have a week to review and edit, and we could really focus your May 27th meeting on a consolidated set of notes, edits to the council that would help guide them in approving the chapters at the June 2nd meeting. So understanding there might be a final set of edits that need to happen after the June 2nd meeting, but it's hard to envision like all of these chapters going up to the council and a group of 20 people discussing and debating edits. So we thought that the role of the steering committee, as suggested at one of your other meetings, might be a nice place to try to find that balance of voice and tone that is hard when you have differing opinions on things. So this is a proposal to you all to discuss and consider how you want to handle it. And then Liz added in just that she's been working closely with Judy around updating and pulling together the land acknowledgement, and that will be part of that updated suite of chapters that come to you at the June 2nd meeting.
Thanks, Jane. Liz and then Jared.
I am fine with the steering committee playing kind of a, group consolidated editing role. I think that's a perfectly reasonable idea, given that the council's going to see the whole thing and it might be helpful. And so that's great. My question is really more around how this timeline does or does not jibe with the discussion we just had on the key priorities and potentially both streamlining / combining or lifting some of those up. To me, it doesn't really feel like it fits that timeline, since the chapters, it feels like we're treating the chapters more as background rather than as kind of a necessary conversation with the key priorities discussion. So I'm just wondering if that is the impression of others, whether this all works but needs to kind of shift back a bit. Like, I don't understand personally how we would vote on agreeing on final edits to chapters on June 2nd without the priority actions completed and done. And I know it's going to be later in June. So anyway, you get my question.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I have some reactions to that, but Jared, were you going down a similar path or a different path?
Similar and additional.
Well, yeah, why don't you jump in and then let's have a conversation quickly about it.
Yeah, I mean, my sense throughout has been that the prioritization discussion has is is not about taking anything out of the plan. It's about lifting up for um, additional attention or specific attention, the most important recommendations, either in terms of the multiple um, obligations of the cap from mitigation to resilience to adaptation. And so it does feel possible to respond to Liz's specific question. It does feel possible to me to review and approve the chapters on their own, recognizing that well, between the chapters and the appendices, everything's going to be included. And then kind of what gets lifted up, in that summary chapter that Secretary Moore and I have volunteered to draft once the recommendations are written, when we're summarizing the highest priorities, that feels to me a complementary, but not mutually exclusive piece. Um, the other thing I was going to say with regard to this proposed process and steering committee role, I think absolutely we need a smaller group to take feedback and be focused on penning the final revisions. And I think that the steering committee is the most natural group for that to fall to, as long as folks are willing, and I'm willing to help play that role with others. I do think that at the same time, though, it's important to recognize that we're approaching the stage of the process where, in order to approve the plan, every counselor's kind of say and vote has equal weight. And so if there are, to me, it's like, yeah, the steering committee is a good starting point, but if there's people who really want to dive in and have specific feedback, I want to be clear about what their outlet is, for, and what the timeline is for them to share those requests, with the steering committee, if that's going to be a final drafting group, or a final revising group. Um, and I'm just remembering, like, not that it was ideal, but it did work. I'm remembering those last two meetings we did, um, ahead of the approval of the last cap, where we were literally going through chapter by chapter, and there were parts that were consensus and there were parts that had to come to a vote, and it's hard for me to see how that gets avoided. I think we can do as much work as possible to minimize that by the process that we've done to date, and by having the steering committee try to consolidate the process towards the end for revisions. But there might be things that individual counselors or subgroups of counselors who may or may not be reflected in the steering committee will want to see as we wind down and get closer to the final adoption and the votes that go along with that.
Thanks, Jared. I see Julie, your hand went up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are you
jump
able
in.
to just scroll back up, David, to the previous slide? I wonder if those office hours that are proposed here are sort of that solution for, or at least opportunity for other council members to provide specific input. I think there's kind of two needs here. I agree with Jared. We don't want to foreclose the opportunity for anybody to provide input. But I also think there's a real need for several people. And in this instance, I do think it makes sense for it to be the steering committee to read the entire report and ensure that it hangs together. And I think that sort of those two companion opportunities. And if there's somebody in the rest of the council who would really like to do the full read of the climate plan, great. And maybe they can just plan to join the steering committee on our timeline as we go about that work. But I do think this idea for office hours is really a great place for many counselors to be able to weigh in with their thoughts and concerns and proposed edits.
Thanks, Julie. One thing, yes, and um, I want I want to make sure we're not conflating a little bit the role here of the steering committee with like final edits, right? Because I feel like what's being proposed here for the steering committee is do what you just said, Julie, like read through the whole thing, really from a more holistic point of view, say, these are really critical edits that we're suggesting happen, right? And then that goes to the full council, and the full council is like, yeah, those are great edits, right? And we'll have that conversation in the full council as well. But it's a way of sort of jump starting that more holistic review and coming together with some shared edits that can accelerate the work we do in the full council. So I would hesitate to call them like Jared, like I wouldn't call it like the final writing group or something like that, because I feel like it's more like an
Yeah.
input into the council conversation that really accelerates that council
Yeah.
conversation. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's much better phrased, and I totally agree.
Okay. Then getting back to Liz's point, which is carrying through too, which is, okay, well, what are these chapters anyway? And can you even write them without doing our additional prioritization conversation like we said we want to do, right? If we want to try to get to something that feels more like a top 10. And my sense is that even though it may feel a little awkward, I'm kind of where you landed, Jared, which is the chapters are fundamental context, right? And fundamental reasoning for the types of things this plan focuses on, right? And you can write that even if we haven't pulled out, one or two of those as part of our top 10. I feel like you can write that because these are the things that we're focusing on, both in terms of the top 50 and the full table, right? And so my hope, Liz Miller, is that, it doesn't feel like too much of a stretch to make good progress on chapters, even as the council is trying to figure out how it might articulate a top 10. I recognize that may feel a little frustrating. And I think with the guidance that's being provided for these recommendations chapters, it kind of makes sense. But Liz, I'll circle back to you for sure on that.
No, that's fine. If folks think that's possible, that's great. I had thought that the chapter directive was to focus with the key priorities in mind. In other words, not to be duplicative. And that was part of the way we were going to tighten them up. So I am concerned that as you talk about pulling out a top 10, it differs from the way I've heard the public comments at the sessions in terms of overlap, duplicative, sometimes contradictory. I do think that somebody, and it could be somebody in your shop or the CAO, needs to take a really serious look at places in the 50 plus priorities that really speak either over each other or to each other, and figure out ahead of time a way that those can either be combined or streamlined. It happens particularly, but not exclusively, with the cross-cutting issues.
Yeah.
And in general, the comments that I was hearing were supportive of the way the cross-cutting issues put forward those ideas, and less supportive in general, again, this is just general comment, of the way that the more specific areas might have treated the same issue. And that could speak to Secretary Moore's point about plain English. It also could be, it also could be more substantive. I think it depends. But until that work gets done, I remain concerned that we're not getting to a point where we can actually finalize chapters. But I understand everybody's point, and obviously I am willing to work along.
So that to me, Liz, when I hear you say that, like we're trying to avoid the duplicative stuff with some of these groups that are meeting, like all the emissions reductions groups or the ag ecosystem with rural resilience group. But what I'm hearing from you is that, hang on a second, is actually the cross-cutting and how that intersects with those that's really important. So I wonder if there's a process we need to put in place right now
I don't know.
around that.
Well, and I mean, you've attended, or your people have attended all of them. I have not attended all of them. So if I'm wrong about the overall feedback, not just including taking what we already have and lifting some up, but instead getting rid of some of the confusing overlap and or even potentially somewhat contradictory, then yeah, that needs to happen. And I don't think it's exclusively cross-cutting. That's just where it was most evident. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, just want to make sure we're covering that. And that was that more so than finding the top 10 or whatever was the basis for my comment about finalizing the chapters too quickly or in the wrong order.
Mm. Okay, that's helpful, Liz. I appreciate that. And I wonder, steering committee members, like Liz Miller just said, hey, maybe uh, the Climate Action Office or CBI or some combination could do that scrub. And I'm wondering, like, is that the right thing? Do you want to do that scrub? Like, we're very sensitive in this moment about who's kind of in charge. So I'm just curious, like, when you think about the task that Liz Miller's comment suggests, like, how does that task get done? Julie?
I think it has to be us. I mean, I appreciate the capacity that CBI and the climate office can provide to some extent, but ultimately this is a report from the Climate Council, and it feels really important for the council to be leading on making those kinds of decisions. I think it's a different story when it comes to ensuring we're using plain language and helping identify places that may be hard for folks to understand and interpret, but in making content, like true content decisions, I think it's got to sit with us.
So if that is the case, like, do we have the right time on the books and the right structure for doing that, right? Because I feel like there's a couple threads to that. One is how this all shows up in the chapters, right? The other is the language of the priority actions and, and just looking at those 54 and saying, hang on a second, like what if we took those three and combined them, right? Or what if we actually wrote this more over here and we don't need to have it over here as a duplicative thing, right? That's a piece of work that's going to require a little bit of time. So I'm curious if you all want to put some time on the books for yourselves to do that. Jared?
Yeah, I generally agree with what Julie said and with what you just suggested, David. I do want to make or offer a slight nuance, which is I totally agree with Secretary Moore in terms of the final decisions around the content of the words on in terms of the recommendations and what's in the climate action plan being kind of approved by and comfortable with the council. That said, I do think that there's a unique and important role that David, you and your team, and that Jane and the Climate Action Office are playing in terms of either facilitating or being in many of these meetings and conversations in the process and being aware of opportunities to help reduce duplication or help identify areas where there's redundancy or confusion. And I, for one, would be comfortable, seeing and then considering recommended or possible revisions, so long as they are transparently provided as such and we can kind of see them in like the big way that this showed up last time for me is wanting to always be sure that we're seeing documents that have track changes shown rather than cleaned up documents and we can't see the before and after. So I think I think everything that you and Julie said is right in terms of the role, the process. I would just add that I would be comfortable and think it perhaps helps streamline the process a bit if there's an opportunity for suggested revisions to be offered because of the vantage point and the experience that you and Jane and your teams have, to have those shared with us for an initial decision by the steering committee and a final decision by the climate council, so long as we can see really transparently in track change format what that would be.
when would you see that happening? And we're about to run out of time. I apologize. But it seems like I'm feeling Liz Miller's angst about like the timing and the sequence of all this, right? Um, because I feel like the chapter writing can make great progress even as we're like finalizing exact language on priority actions and finalizing, you know, um, a further prioritization. There's plenty to do there and with the guidance that's available. Um, However, we do need to like circle in if we're going to make some changes and things. Like, does that happen before our next council meeting? Does it happen immediately after our next council meeting? Right? So we take the mandate from the council, we take a fresh eye from, some subset of the steering committee with help from Jane or myself or others. Like, I'm just trying to imagine the time needed to get this work done and who's actually doing it. Like, do we gather on Tuesday the 20th after our, excuse me, or do we gather like next week, sometime like the 6th? I don't know. I'm just trying to, I'm trying to resist the temptation to be like, oh, great. Yeah, CBI, I'll take that on. We'll get that back to you. Like that. I'm trying to resist that temptation because I know it in myself. I'm like, oh, I can see a million good ways to do this. I just want to make sure that you all are in the driver's seat and are feeling very comfortable about what's happening, and are part of it. Jared?
I think that that's a good idea. We could try to identify some time to block off now. I also think that the scope, I think we know we're gonna need some time. The amount of time we're gonna need and the process we're gonna need, I think will only really become clear after the council meeting on Monday. So I wonder
Yeah.
if we hold some time now, but maybe we could say at the end of the council meeting on Monday, steering committee members and anyone else who's interested in the process kind of stick on so that we can identify the path forward kind of as it's fresh and in real time after the end of that council
Okay.
meeting.
Okay. All right. I mean, it sounds good. We're out of time now. I don't know, Jane and others, I don't want to get out in front here, but I feel like this idea, like, is there a group of steering committee members who want to gather like Tuesday at 8 a.m. next week, right? Or Wednesday at 8 a.m. next week and like really start to do this process, that we're talking about. And that would be together, like we're doing those office hours things those same days, the 6th and the 7th. Sarah?
I just want to say I've appreciated this discussion and having not been here for the original release of the plan, getting my brain wrapped around the kind of enormity of what has to happen in the next, I guess, the coming weeks and months. So I've appreciated this discussion, and I think getting time blocked off to the extent that's possible will be helpful.
Okay, great. So let's finish up now. I wonder, I'm interested quick before we get off the phone. Jane, do you have any thoughts on this process right now, that we're talking about, and whether the steering committee gets a little extra time on the books, maybe like a Tuesday, Wednesday next week, early in the morning, like an 8 a.m. kind of thing? Like, does that sound like a good idea? Do you want to say anything about that right now?
Yeah, just to be clear, that's really around process still, though. We won't have anything to be editing. So that's my question. Like, is that what you want to do at that time? I think I'm missing
Yeah.
the punchline.
I'm imagining that there's already things that steering committee members can imagine about consolidating. I'm talking about the priority actions right now, the 54, right? And we're going to have a lot to talk about on Monday, the 5th at the council meeting. And with that feedback, the steering
Yes,
committee could actually take kind of a first whack at pulling priority actions together and tightening up and doing things, right?
I think that sounds great. We're happy to work to schedule that with the steering committee.
Okay, great. All right, folks, we are over and I apologize. Let me just make sure there's nothing else we're supposed to do today. Hang on one second. Um, I think that's it. Um, Thanks, everyone. Anything pending before we jump off? Okay, great.
See you
Everybody.
Monday.
All right, happy Monday.
Good night.
That's right. Take care. Have a good week. Bye.